Okay, so you want to buy an aircraft carrier? 100,000 tons of steel, a squadron of 60-plus jets known as the Air Wing, a floating airport that can park itself off the coast of any country on Earth and remind them exactly who's in charge. You've already got the private jet, you've already got the yacht. This just feels like the next line item. But here's the strange part. You could have $13 billion sitting in a bank account right now, verified, ready to wire, and you would still be no closer to owning an aircraft carrier than the person sitting next to you with $40. Not because of the price, because there is no listing, no dealership, no auction house, no billionaire who has ever closed this deal. Every working aircraft carrier on the planet belongs to a government, and every one of those governments has laws that make it a felony to sell you one. This is the one machine in this whole series you cannot simply write a check for, no matter how large the check is. So today's going to work a little differently. Instead of pricing out your purchase, we're pricing out a country's purchase because the logic underneath it is stranger than anything a private buyer could dream up. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why no billionaire has ever owned one, where the money disappears to every single day, whether the ship fires a single missile or not, why the most expensive warship ever built was recently taken down by its own laundry room, and how one man in Macau accidentally bought China its first aircraft carrier while telling everyone he was building a casino. Let's start with what it costs you, hypothetically, as a nation. Aircraft carriers come in 3 sizes, and they're 3 completely different levels of national commitment. At the bottom sits the light carrier, a ski jump ramp instead of a catapult, jets that hop off the bow like a kid off a diving board. Britain's Queen Elizabeth class runs $3 to $4 billion a ship, and Italy built the Cavour for around $2 billion, cheap by this industry's standards, and it buys a country a seat at the table without a second mortgage on the treasury. Step up a tier and you hit the mid-size catapult-launched carrier, the kind built by nations who want real air power and are willing to pay full price for it. France's Charles de Gaulle cost roughly $3.5 billion, the only nuclear-powered carrier on Earth that doesn't fly an American flag. Then, at the very top of the ladder, there's the American supercarrier, the Gerald R. Ford class, and the number here stops looking like a price tag and starts looking like a typo. $13 billion for the lead ship alone before it has launched a single aircraft. And here's the detail that should actually worry you. $13 billion is the cheapest number in this entire video. The gap between these tiers isn't marketing, it's physics and metallurgy. A light carrier skips the 2 most expensive systems that exist on a modern flight deck, a catapult, and in most cases, a nuclear reactor. The Ford class carries both. It has the electromagnetic aircraft launch system, a bank of induction motors that flings a 40,000-pound jet from a standstill to over 150 miles an hour in under 2 seconds. And it has 2 nuclear reactors running underneath that catapult around the clock. Whether a single jet ever takes off or not, every one of those systems adds billions to the bill before a single sailor has even reported for duty. There's also a fourth path, one that looks like a shortcut and almost never is: buying used. In 2004, Russia handed India a mothballed Soviet carrier, the Admiral Gorshkov, essentially for free on the condition that India pay for the refit. The quoted price was $974 million. By the time the ship, renamed INS Vikramaditya, actually reached India 9 years later, the bill had climbed past $2 billion. The sea trials alone had ballooned from $27 million to $550 million, and the ship broke down on its way home. Free turned out to be the single most expensive word in the deal. This is also why so few countries even attempt this. Roughly 9 nations on Earth currently operate a working aircraft carrier: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Spain, Russia, China, India, and Thailand, whose single carrier mostly stays tied up in port and functions closer to an extremely expensive royal yacht. That's the entire list. Out of nearly 200 countries, fewer than 5% have ever managed to keep one of these things running long-term. Not because the idea is complicated, because the idea is a permanent, decades-long subscription, and most national budgets tap out long before the first ship is even finished. Now we get to the question that actually matters. Where does the money come from? On every other video in this series, this is the beat where the business flips inside out. The casino makes its real money off the slot machines, not the tables. The gas station makes its money off the convenience store, not the pump. So what's the hidden profit center on an aircraft carrier? There isn't one. That's the answer. This is the only entry in this entire series with 0 revenue. Not thin margins, not a loss leader hiding a real business underneath. Zero. An aircraft carrier has never sold a ticket, rung up a sale, or generated $1 of income in its entire existence. Every other video in this series ends on a number that's positive. This one only produces a number that's negative, and it gets bigger every single year the ship stays afloat. So why does a government keep paying for something that has never once made money? Because the return isn't counted in dollars. It's counted in what doesn't happen. A carrier parked off a coastline is a government paying every day to make sure a war never starts there in the first place, and the entire model rests on nobody ever actually finding out whether that insurance policy would hold. And here's the part that breaks people's brains. The single most expensive weapons platform humans have ever built can, in theory, be threatened by something that costs about as much as a nice house. A modern anti-ship missile runs somewhere around $2 to $10 million, which means a country could credibly threaten a $13 billion carrier with a weapon worth roughly 0.1% of its price. Naval planners have a name for this, the cost imposition problem, and it's the quiet anxiety sitting underneath every carrier deployment. You're sending a floating city worth more than some country's entire GDP into range of a weapon that costs less than a nice apartment in Manhattan. Which brings us to the part where things actually break, because they do constantly, and not always where you'd expect. In March of 2026, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the $13 billion flagship of the entire United States Navy, caught fire, not from an enemy strike, from the laundry room. Sailors fought the blaze for over 30 hours while the ship was in the middle of active combat operations. That fire didn't happen in isolation either. It landed near the end of an 11-month deployment, one of the longest in carrier history, after the Ford had already been run hard supporting 2 separate wars back-to-back with barely a break between them. By the time she finally limped home to Norfolk, Navy estimates suggested she could be out of action for close to 2 years of repairs. 2 years where the country's newest, most expensive carrier sits tied to a pier, still drawing a full crew's salary, still burning through its maintenance budget, contributing exactly 0 sorties, 0 deterrence, 0 anything to the fleet she was built to lead. That wasn't even the ship's most infamous problem. The Ford's vacuum toilet system, redesigned along with everything else on the new class, kept clogging under the daily strain of 4,500 people, and fixing it means sending an acid flush through the pipework at a cost of about $400,000 every single time. The most technologically advanced warship on the planet has spent years fighting its own bathrooms. Step back for a second and look at what's underneath all of this. A carrier's nuclear reactor doesn't need refueling for 20 to 25 years, but when it finally does, the Navy has to pull the entire ship apart to swap the fuel and rebuild everything around it. A single process that can cost several $billion and take 4 to 5 years, nearly a tenth of the ship's entire 50-year lifespan spent in a dry dock instead of at sea. The Navy calls this a refueling and complex overhaul, and it's already baked into the budget of every nuclear carrier. The moment it's launched, only a handful of shipyards on the planet can even attempt that job, and in the United States, there's exactly one. Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, the sole facility on the planet capable of building or overhauling an American nuclear carrier. Lose that one shipyard to a strike, a hurricane, or a bad decade of underinvestment, and the entire U.S. carrier program has nowhere else to go, and none of this even touches the crew living inside it. A Ford-class carrier still needs roughly 4,500 people to run it. Sailors who typically earn somewhere between $30,000 and $60,000 a year to spend months at a stretch welded inside a floating nuclear reactor. One fire, one clogged pipe, one overdue overhaul, and a weapon built to project an entire nation's power is sitting in a harbor doing nothing, still costing exactly the same amount of money every single day, and still paying every one of those 4,500 salaries. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question. How much does it really cost to own one of these things? Take the American supercarrier, the top of the ladder. The hull is $13 billion. Just keeping it crewed, fed, and floating. Salaries, maintenance, fuel for the escort ships, port calls run somewhere between $1 and $1.5 billion a year, and that's before you've touched the air wing. The 70-plus fighter jets that actually fly off the deck cost another $3 to $5 billion to buy outright and roughly $1.8 billion a year just to fly and maintain, and the carrier never actually sails alone. It travels surrounded by what the Navy calls a carrier strike group, guided missile destroyers, cruisers, and a fast attack submarine, an entire flotilla built and crewed for the sole purpose of protecting the one ship in the middle. Fold the escorts into the daily bill and the cost of the whole formation climbs to somewhere between $6 and $8 million a day, close to $300,000 an hour. That's the real number running every time you see one of these things on the news. Stack it across a 50-year service life and the all-in lifetime cost pushes past $70 or $80 billion for one ship before a single multi-billion-dollar refueling overhaul and before a single missile is ever fired in its defense. Go to the bottom of the ladder instead, the mid-sized nuclear carrier, and the annual bill drops to around $230 million a year, roughly $27,000 an hour, which sounds almost reasonable until you remember it's still one ship costing more per year than most companies make in revenue, with no revenue of its own to ever show for it, and the bill doesn't even end when the ship finally retires. Scrapping a nuclear-powered carrier and safely disposing of its reactors runs somewhere between $750 million and $900 million, compared to about $53 million for a conventionally powered ship. You don't just pay to build it and pay to run it, you pay one last time just to make it go away. Which brings us to the strangest transaction in the history of naval warfare. In 1998, a former Chinese basketball player named Xu Zhengping walked into a shipyard auction in Ukraine and personally bid $20 million on a rusting, unfinished Soviet carrier called the Varyag. He told the Ukrainians, the press, and the Macau government that he was building the world's largest floating casino. He wasn't. He was secretly fronting the purchase for the Chinese military, which couldn't buy the ship directly without triggering a diplomatic crisis. Macau denied his casino license. Nobody involved seemed to mind. The ship then spent close to 500 days being towed in circles off Istanbul because Turkey wouldn't let it through the strait, and by the time it finally reached China in 2002, Xu had personally burned through $120 million of his own money. Money the Chinese government never fully paid back. He sold his house. He spent the next 18 years repaying the debt. That rusted hull became the Liaoning, China's first operational aircraft carrier, and the direct ancestor of the fleet, Beijing, is still expanding today. The only man who ever personally paid for an aircraft carrier went broke doing it, and he still doesn't own it. Nobody ever does. You just get to keep paying the bill.